Hey Femboys, fashion advice for a man who looks like a slowly decomposing roadkill wombat. Hey Femboys, fashion advice for a man who looks like an unfired house brick. Fashion advice for a man who looks like the before picture for any health product. Fashion advice for a man who looks like a proof of concept model for dad bod. Fashion advice for a man who looks like what you'd get if you ordered William T. Riker from wish.com. So, question of the day, is femboy a slur? This video kind of mutated out of some thoughts I had about the other two videos I made this week, touching on masculinity and also what even is a slur. And yes, I know, 3 political videos in a week. Sorry if that's not your jam, but what else am I gonna do? It's the end of December and there's sweet bugger all going on in tech and gaming and stuff at the moment. Don't panic though, there's plenty more of that gamer, tech nerd, pop culture stuff coming soon enough. But this does tie into internet pop culture and anime, and also memes, so that might be enough for you. Content warning before we get going though, as should be obvious by the title, we'll be talking about possible slurs, and I'm not going to use any hard slurs in this video, but some of the phrases that I might be using are words that might make you, frankly, a bit squirmy, and frankly there's one in here that makes me a bit squirmy too, but do know that I'm coming from a place of love and not hostility, in a hope to understand and promote understanding in others. And on this topic in particular, I can only speak for me, and my view is one on the outside of this looking in, although I try to be as educated and thoughtful and respectful as I can, and maybe I got something wrong here, so feel free to kindly tell me how you feel about it versus how I feel about it. So, question of the day, is femboy a slur? Or is it a word we can just have some fun with? Earlier in the year, femboy hooters trended on Twitter. It became a bit of a meme, lots of wacky fan art, and it became a thing people argued about for a bit. And then it just went away because internet attention spans. And similar things have surged and vanished in various places online over time. This year especially though, I've seen the femboy thing pop up a bit more often. 2 years now of most of us being online way more frequently than ever is doing things to the discourse, I think. And the claim femboy is a slur, this time, without the Hooters stuff, had a resurgence this week. I tripped over it while doing some research for my last couple of videos about masculinity and slurs respectively. Apparently, it's spawning from the tiktok.com/zoomers have the attention span of a crack-addicted squirrel place of the internet. The whole femboy is a slur thing, to put it simply, well, hang on, actually. Let's get our terms straight. Well, not straight, because, well, it's a turn of phrase, and it's not straight in the literal or figurative sense of the whole LGBTQ kind of stuff. What was I saying about attention spans? Sorry, Zoomers, I have no self-awareness. So we have that in common. Let's team up against the millennials and the boomers. Gen X and the Zoomers, together as one. Hashtag Team Zoomers. You guys take care of everything that needs big floofy haircuts and dance routines that last precisely 23 seconds, and we'll handle anything that needs a lifetime supply of cynicism and sarcasm. Bitterness. So what is a slur anyway? I talked about this in the video I made just the other day in detail in a different context, but to recap real quick from that, a slur is just a word used with the intent to cause harm through derision or mockery or making someone feel unsafe or disrespected and lessened. You get it, right? It's not that complicated. Some words are always considered slurs. Some are only considered slurs when used in a certain context and with a certain intent behind them. Queer, for example, is not a slur, not for those of us who use it as a self-identifying language. In that way, it's a reclaimed slur. You may have even heard it used at gay pride parades. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. It's a chant older than even my greybeard self. That's how long that's been being reclaimed. Which means, you know, I'm sure any day now, the last screeching, flailing dregs of the hilariously out of touch people panicking as they see the world leave them behind, even further out of touch and alone, will get used to it indeed. Any day now. But queer is still absolutely a slur. When some screeching out of touch dingleberry is yelling it in impotent hollow fury across the street at someone. So, to some people in the LGBTQIA+ community, even today, even while others reclaim the word, queer is still an unwelcome word to them. One gay man might ask that you not call him queer. Another one might be perfectly okay with it. 5 others might make a whole damn TV show with the word right there in the title so you can't possibly ignore it in the hope to normalize it and make straight people less wiggy about gay men by being as non-threatening as it's possible to be. But if someone tells you not to use that word for them specifically, you can go ahead and respect that. Don't do it anymore. Don't argue with them. Don't question them about it. Don't tell them all about how a TV show said it was okay to use the word now. Just hear them when they tell you a thing. We all have words we don't like to be called. Karen, right? Karen. It feels pretty hostile and disrespectful when people call you words that you think are slurs, doesn't it, Karen? Be nice if people would not do that, wouldn't it, Karen? So queer, being a slur or not a slur, is a bit of a squishy one. Femboy is a bit like that, but also not like that exactly. I don't use TikTok, and frankly every time I browse it using their web interface, I can feel myself aging. But that's cool. I'm Gen X, and that's not my space. It's not supposed to be for me. I'm supposed to be baffled by the weird things kids think is entertainment these days. My mum never understood my obsession with karate amphibians, for example. Anyway, TikTok makes my brain dissolve, so I poked around on Twitter and on YouTube to get a feel for the discourse, where I did run across some TikTok reposted stuff anyway. The question I was looking to answer is the use of the term femboy doing harm, or being used in the hope of doing harm, the measure of a slur? So how was it being used? By who? And how do people react to it? Well, almost exclusively it's being used by people calling themselves femboys, so not a slur in that case. I saw some people putting forth the notion that it's being used in a way that can be seen as fetishizing trans people, which would be fair, except there is a difference between the people who use femboy for themselves and trans women. They share some similarities, sure, but definitely different. So before we dig deeper into the use of the word still, let's unpack what it even means to be a femboy in the first place. Femboys, as the name implies, are boys, like old school doesn't confuse the capitalist boomer type boys, cis boys, whose sex and gender are both boy. Femboys are men who like dressing and presenting as especially strongly feminine, but also not making any claim to being a woman. You might have picked up on it, but the word boy is right there in the word femboy. And that might be problematic insofar as a lot of anti-trans people claim that that's what trans women do and are. They pretend, they pantomime, they perform. It's a simple dress-up game. But to a self-identifying femboy, it simply isn't the same thing as being a trans woman, and neither side of that fence usually claims that it is the same thing. I say usually because I'll swing back on that in a second. There is an exception. But it's easy to see the argument that femboys kind of muddy the waters a bit and make it a bit harder for trans women to feel heard or earnestly understood. Or it at the very least gives the bigots and uninformed something to point at and claim that it's like it's some sort of gotcha. Kind of like how certain people can't separate sex and gender as different words we have for describing different concepts. They get confused by it, and then they get angry because nobody likes being confused. It makes them feel stupid for not understanding something, and no one likes feeling stupid and confused. It's embarrassing. But yeah, I get it. Some people think it's hard enough to get people to really understand the lived experience of a trans person without adding the complication of femboys into the mix, into the discussion. Especially when a lot of femboys fade in and out of acutely feminine presentation at will, while most trans women don't do that because they're women, not feminine boys. There's even some people who think that femboys are just trans girls, or indeed non-binaries, who just haven't pushed all the way past their own internalized transphobia yet, so they're not ready for that final step. And maybe some aren't. It's a fair question, one most femboys probably ask themselves at some point. But that's also not a thing anyone else gets to decide on behalf of any given femboy. No one gets to tell them, oh, you're actually this, by the way. You're being the wrong thing. Or accuse them of being dishonest or self-loathing or anything like that. That's no more fair than it's fair for someone to accuse a trans man of being a self-hating woman with internalized misogyny, as is often the case from the TERF type people. Don't do that. It's all kinds of shitty. Maybe though, it's more helpful to think of a femboy as something closer to a drag queen. Most, but not all, drag queens are blokes who perform as women. Sometimes literally performing on a stage, sometimes just when they're out having fun. They play a character who has a name and an attitude and a style all of their own, and explore their own femininity and other repressed personality traits through that character. But femboys aren't quite the same as that either. They're not usually performing, not in the same ostentatious or confrontational way that drag queens do, certainly. Nor are they playing a character distinctly separated from their regular boy identity, their own identity. They're still using clothes and hair and wigs and makeup and altering their mannerisms and presentation, perhaps even speech, in a performative way to explore and display their own feminine side. And as much as I've seen out there, they usually use the same name for both modes of presentation too. So really not all that much like a drag queen's drag persona is. Is persona the right word? Drag queens? Any out there? People who know drag queens? I'm still reasonably ignorant of the whole drag queen scene. The loudness and ostentatiousness of it sort of bounces off my little autistic brain a little bit sometimes, so the whole overwhelmingly mighty presence of a drag queen kind of overloads me a little bit. So hopefully persona is the right word. If it's not, correct me, you know where. But certainly the general aesthetic for a femboy is way toned down to the "I dare you to even try not to notice me" style of a drag queen. Femboys tend to be more, let's call it traditionally feminine, less saturated in their style choices. Crossdresser could be a term, but that term is pretty old-fashioned, and I've not really heard it used by anyone except a baffled, confused boomer in quite some time, and thanks to Hollywood, it carries its own set of problematic stereotypes that a lot of people would rather keep their distance from, like low Earth orbit distance. So maybe not that term, but maybe that feels a bit closer, doesn't it? Femboy is often conflated with the term trap as well, quite often in weeb circles, anime and manga nerds. Anime nerd, by the way, is one of my own self-identifiers, so I say it and mean it with love and respect. But I hate the word trap when used for what we've been calling femboys to this point. It implies they're trying to trick straight men into acts of gayness against their will by making themselves as feminine and cute as and attractive as possible to fool the hapless straight bloke into getting horny feelings for them. Which is also another problematic attitude that is weaponized against trans women especially, that they're predators, wolves in sheep's clothing, an inherent sneaky danger to real women. So yeah, that's also all kinds of shitty. The whole trap thing makes me quite huffy sometimes. It's not always meant to imply willful deception and homophobic overtones, but it's hard to escape the shadow that that word casts. In anime and manga, there's a Japanese term that translates most directly to male daughter. In Japan, it's the slang for a boy who dresses like a girl. When these are translated into English, it used to be commonly translated as trap. More commonly these days, it's translated as femboy. But it still depends on the translator and the story and any biases either of those things have. Which, considering some of those fictional characters are deliberately trying to be deceptive because stories need drama, that could be an issue as well, especially considering how much of femboy style influence and the subculture itself has revolved around and drawn from manga, doujinshi, and anime, and the tendency for all that media to have examples of and be more accepting of representations of men who do present more feminine in various ways compared to a lot of Western media. South Korea has a similar thing too going on in the K-pop scene. Look at any K-pop boy band and tell me that they're all about traditional masculinity ideals. But frankly, most discourse I found on Twitter and other places is people laughing at how silly it is to even consider femboy a slur. It's a bit ridiculous. I found comparatively few claiming it was a slur. Few are still seemingly doing so in an earnest and honest way instead of leaning into the meme of it all or just trying to get a rise out of people. But it's also worth noting this kind of discourse that we're having right now can confuse the issue of what labels like this are even actually for in the first place. It's not actually up to discussions like this to decide or ratify what these words are officially for and who gets to use them. These kinds of words are useful tools, not tests to pass, not a checklist of traits you have to fulfill enough of to be awarded your official certificate of title, certified femboy. They're not there so other people can sort you into a nice little tidy box. They're there so you can find one that makes sense to you, perhaps maybe more than one. And how you want to communicate your own personal experience, firstly to yourself, and secondly to other people, and to help you find others with shared experiences so you can keep exploring what it means to you by talking about it with other people with similar experiences. And most importantly, labels you choose as markers for your own self-identity are not fixed. You don't have to choose one or two or three and then just be that forevermore. It can, for many people, be an evolving, flexible process, so don't get too hung up on the labels. As for femboy in particular, I like it. It's a pretty cute word and pretty self-explanatory, really. And as a self-selected descriptor, I think it's fun. Men who really enjoy exploring and expressing their strongly felt but internal feminine side with performative actions like fashion and makeup and such, to make it show externally for a while, to give it air to breathe, to feed it. It has to feel super affirming to be able to just reject so wholly the socially typical masculinity and embrace your feminine traits like that. It's maybe not too dissimilar to why I list he, him, and they, them as my pronouns in places like my Twitter bio. See, I like they, them as singular pronouns for myself sometimes because it mentally and emotionally kind of decouples me from my complicated relationship with my own masculinity and what I was taught that I was supposed to feel like as a man when I was growing up. Made a video all about this just the other day if you're curious about it, if you haven't seen it. Although I did leave out the pronoun stuff because that video was already super long and covered plenty already, but that's also part of it for me. So I wonder if femboys use their dress-up time. Is that a good way to say that? But I do wonder if they use that in a similar way to decouple themselves from internalized expectations of masculinity for a while, to be released of the weight of it and swish about, free to be as cutesy and as soft in a way that might not feel quite right when in a more masculine expressive mode. So I think femboy is good. I think femboys are good. The only real issue I see with femboy is how often it's fetishized and objectified down to nothing but sexual stuff. And that can be pretty reductive for some people, and for women, it can be seen in particular as exasperating the issue of their own side of that coin, because everything about being a woman is objectified and sexualized in one way or another. Now, I'm sex positive, and I don't think it's inherently bad to fetishize and sexualize things. It's part of human nature and helps make expressing sexual feelings feel less shameful and repressed for some people. Fetishes are very useful tools. But it can have issues in how some kinds of fetishization bleed over into how people get treated in non-sexy time spaces, especially women. And being that femininity is something that femboys play with, well, you can see the issue that some people might be able to pluck out of that. Speaking more personally, I've absolutely personally found femboys cute, even sexy. But for me, as a pan-romantic grey asexual, my physical, aesthetic attraction, emotional attraction, romantic attraction, and sexual attraction are all not necessarily connected and talking to each other in the way they do for most people. So it's complicated. And the way we use language doesn't always work very elegantly for what I need to say about the kind of attraction I feel towards someone else, femboy or otherwise. But in general, I'd love to live in a world where femboys were happy to express themselves and felt safe to do so and just wander the world in a dress and at will, and not just be mostly restricted to safer spaces and their social media accounts. So it could be at least less often fetishized and more normalized in the real world. I mean, some of the subculture corners of femboy internets that I've tripped over recently are pretty trashy and pretty cringy, but name me one internet subculture without any of that trashy, cringy stuff. It's just part of the game. What I do know is that every time I've seen a reposted TikTok video of a femboy on display or whatever, they seem to be having an absolute blast with it. No shame, no self-repression, just boldness and joy in their eyes. And I do feel a little envy in that, because I don't feel that way often about how I look to other people. I mean, I'm not a huge chud fuggo. I can clean up okay when I need to, but I've never felt pretty. I bet that feels good. bet it feels good to feel pretty. But also, I'm a chunk of a man with a hairy chest and muscular legs and, biceps and stuff. So even if I wanted to, I'd make a less than kawaii example of a femboy. I'd probably even make a pretty rubbish drag queen. Also the beard. I'm not shaving that. I have a potato of a face without it, and it's hard to be particularly feminine with this. And femtato sounds less fun than femboy, frankly. Hey femboys, fashion advice for a man who looks like a slowly decomposing roadkill wombat. Hey femboys, fashion advice for a man who looks like an unfired house brick. Fashion advice for a man who looks like the before picture for any health product. Fashion advice for a man who looks like a sentient carbohydrate who survives by exclusively eating other sentient carbohydrates. Fashion advice for a man who looks like a proof of concept model for dad bod. Fashion advice for a man who looks like what you'd get if you ordered William T. Riker from Wish.com. Fashion advice for a man who looks like he's made one too many of these self-deprecating jokes now and is going back on the low-carb diet after New Year's. But lastly, because it's a meme, and I know someone won't be able to resist asking it in the comments, are femboys gay? Well, the memes actually are traps, but we've already talked about how I feel about that particular word, so not using it. The real answer, though, is some are straight, some are bi, some are pan, some are ace, some are something else entirely. Some float between anything. If you ever actually need to know if any given femboy has a specific sexual or romantic orientation, perhaps you want to set them up with a friend, or maybe you would very much like some naked fun times with them yourself, well, you're going to have that conversation with them just like you would with anyone else. But outside of that, not really any of your business, is it? Thank you for watching. Hopefully this has been interesting, informative, insightful, or entertaining. Try not to picture me as a femboy, I dare you. Hey femboys, makeup tips for a man whose face looks like a potato. Hey femboys, makeup advice for a man whose face looks like a dog's favorite tennis ball. Thank you as always to the patrons, of course, whose above and beyond support is deeply appreciated. Thank you all for that. And thank you for the rest of you for just making it to the end of the video. Catch you next time.